The medical frigate Gentle Current drifted alone in the cold darkness between star systems. Her engines dead and her hull torn open in 3 places where the enemy weapons had struck her captain. Yellen's Saurus stood at the center of her damaged bridge and watched the emergency lights flicker with each passing minute. Her 4 slender arms wrapped tightly around her body as the temperature continued to drop. She was Volanthe, a species known throughout the galaxy for their peaceful nature and their dedication to healing others. And she had never imagined that her mercy mission would end like this. 6 rotations had passed since the attack. 6 long cycles of broadcasting the same desperate message across every emergency frequency that her damaged communications array could reach. This is the medical frigate Gentle Current requesting immediate assistance. The automated signal repeated again and again. We have 2,000 refugees aboard, including 400 children, and we are losing life. Support systems, please respond. The message traveled across the vast emptiness of space at the speed of light, reaching 14 different stations, operated by the Galactic Council. Within the first 2 rotations, 47 registered vessels picked up the signal, their captains and crews listening to the fear in Captain Saurus's recorded voice. Yet nobody came. The Gentle Current had been on a mission of mercy when the Corvith Hegemony found her, transporting refugees who had fled from worlds that the Hegemony claimed as their own territory. These were families and children and elderly, people who had committed no crime except existing on planets that a military empire wanted to control. The Galactic Council had publicly condemned the Hegemony's expansion and had made speeches about protecting innocent lives and upholding the values of civilization. But speeches did not stop warships, and values meant nothing when enforcement carried a price that nobody wanted to pay. The Corvith cruiser Obedience circled the damaged medical frigate like a predator waiting for its prey to weaken, close enough to jam any long-range communications, but far enough to avoid appearing aggressive on any sensor logs overseer. Kreth commanded the Obedience with the cold efficiency that had made him valuable to the Hegemony, and he had broadcast his own message to anyone who might consider responding to the distress call. The vessel designated Gentle Current is transporting stolen Hegemony assets. His transmission declared in a tone that allowed no argument. Any interference with Hegemony recovery operations will be considered an act of war against our territory and will be met with appropriate military response. The galaxy heard both messages, the desperate plea for help and the threat of consequences. The galaxy chose silence. Captain Saurus had believed in the Council once, had trusted that the grand alliance of species would protect those who could not protect themselves. She had spent her entire career serving others, healing the sick and transporting the wounded, and asking nothing in return except the chance to make the universe a little less cruel. Now she stood on her dying ship and understood that everything she had believed was a comfortable lie. The Council would not risk a conflict with the Hegemony over 2,000 refugees who had no political value and no military importance. The other species would not sacrifice their trade agreements and their diplomatic relationships for strangers they had never met. Everyone performed their calculations and decided that the cost of helping was too high. In the medical bay 3 decks below the bridge, Dr. Venn worked desperately to keep the wounded alive with supplies that were running out and power that kept failing. She had already lost 9 patients to injuries that she could have treated easily if only her equipment still functioned properly. The children in the cargo hold huddled together for warmth as the life support systems struggled to maintain temperatures that would keep them breathing. Their parents held them close and whispered promises that everything would be fine, even though everyone knew those promises were empty. On the bridge, Lieutenant Koros approached Captain Saurus with a datapad that displayed the remaining resources and numbers that told a grim story. "Captain," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the exhaustion that they all felt. "At current consumption rates, we have perhaps 30 hours of breathable air remaining. The water recyclers failed 2 hours ago, and our food supplies will last another 40 hours. Soros took the datapad and studied the numbers, even though she had already memorized them, because looking at data was easier than looking at the faces of her crew. "Have any of the council stations responded to our signal?" she asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it spoken aloud. "No, Captain," Koros replied. "Station 12 acknowledged receipt of our transmission, but stated that they are unable to authorize any response without approval from the regional. Coordinator Station 7 suggested that we negotiate directly with the hegemony vessel." Negotiate, Soros thought bitterly. As if they had anything to negotiate with. The Corvith did not want to talk. They wanted to recapture the refugees and make an example of anyone who had helped them escape surrender. Meant death for the people she had sworn to protect. A slow death in hegemony labor camps, or a quick death as a warning to others who might consider fleeing. "Continue broadcasting," Soros ordered. Someone out there might still have the courage to help us. But even as she spoke the words, she no longer believed them. The hours crawled past like wounded animals, each one bringing the gentle current closer to the end that everyone could see coming. Soros moved through her ship and spoke with her crew and the refugees they carried, offering comfort that she did not feel and hope that she could not justify. She held the hands of the dying and sang quiet songs to frighten children and pretended that she was not terrified herself, and she kept broadcasting, kept sending that signal into the void, because stopping would mean accepting that nobody cared enough to answer. Then, in the 47th hour of their ordeal, the sensor officer made a sound that Soros had never heard from any member of her crew. It was something between a gasp and a cry, a noise of pure shock that brought everyone on the bridge to sudden attention. "Captain," the officer said, her voice trembling in a way that could mean salvation or doom, "we have multiple contacts emerging from faster-than-light Travel 11 vessels on approach vector." Soros felt her heart racing as she turned to face the main display screen. "Identification?" she demanded. "Are they council ships? Are they hegemony reinforcements?" The sensor officer studied her console with wide eyes, checking and rechecking the readings as if she could not believe what the instruments were telling her. "Neither, Captain," she finally answered. "The vessel configurations do not match any council registry. They are broadcasting identification codes from a species called humans." Soros thought, searching her memory for anything she knew about that name. They were from the galactic fringe, from a region that most civilized species avoided, because the worlds there were too hostile for comfortable habitation. Deathworld, some called them. Beings who had evolved on planets where the gravity crushed bones and the atmosphere burned lungs, and everything in nature seemed designed to kill. What are they doing here? Lieutenant Koros whispered. Nobody had an answer, but for the first time in 6 rotations, Captain Yellen Soros felt something that she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt hope. The Terran 9th Expeditionary Fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. 11 warships appearing in the void like predators responding. To the scent of blood, Commander Elise Vance stood on the bridge of the flagship TSS Resolve and studied the tactical display with eyes that had grown cold over 20 years of military service. She was tall for a human woman, with short gray hair and a face marked by scars that she had never bothered to have removed because they reminded her of lessons she needed to remember. The bridge around her hummed with activity as her crew worked their stations with the quiet efficiency that came from years of training and experience. "Report," she ordered, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos like a blade through silk. "Lieutenant Commander, Chun looked up from his tactical console with an expression that mixed anger with determination. "Confirmed, Commander," he said. "One Corvette cruiser designated. Obedience holding position approximately 50 kilometers. From a damaged civilian vessel, the civilian ship is broadcasting a Council standard distress signal that has been active for approximately 47 hours. 47 hours, Vance thought, and felt the familiar cold fury. Building in her chest, she had intercepted the distress call by accident, while her fleet patrolled the frontier, regions that humanity had claimed as their own territory. Signal had been weak and distorted by the Corvette jamming systems, but her communications officer had managed to clean it up enough to understand the desperate plea for help. 2,000 refugees, including 400 children, trapped on a dying ship while a warship circled them like a vulture, waiting for death, and for 47 hours. The entire civilized galaxy had done nothing. Have any Council vessels responded to the distress signal? Vance asked. Even though she already knew the answer from the intelligence reports, her staff had compiled "Negative, Commander." The communications officer replied, "We have intercepted 47 acknowledgments of the signal from various Council stations and registered vessels. None have dispatched assistance, and several have explicitly stated that they will not intervene due to the hegemony's warning." Vance nodded slowly, her expression revealing nothing of the disgust she felt. This was not the first time she had witnessed the Galactic Council's cowardice, and she knew it would not be the last. The Council was an alliance of species who had achieved civilization through cooperation and diplomacy, who had never needed to fight for survival the way humanity had fought. They had evolved on gentle worlds with mild climates and abundant resources, worlds where nature nurtured rather than murdered. They did not understand what it meant to come from a death world, to be shaped by a planet that tested every generation with ice ages and plagues and predators that could tear flesh from. Lone humans were different. Earth had been a crucible that forged her children in fire and blood, a world where survival required cooperation and sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The species that emerged from that crucible carried those lessons in their genes and their culture and their very souls. "Commander," Chun said carefully, "our orders are to patrol the frontier and avoid unnecessary contact with Council or hegemony. Forces engaging the Corvette vessel could create a diplomatic incident." Vance turned to face her tactical officer with an expression that made him take an involuntary step backward. "Lieutenant Commander Chun," she said quietly, "there are 2,000 people on that ship who have been calling for help for 2 days, while everyone who heard them decided that helping was too inconvenient." She paused and let her words settle over the bridge crew like a weight. "I did not join the Terran Navy to watch innocent people die while politicians calculate acceptable losses. If that creates a diplomatic incident, then what? Diplomats can clean up the mess after we are finished." Murmur of approval rippled through the bridge, quiet but unmistakable. The crew of the Resolve had served with Vance for 3 years, and they knew the kind of officer she was. She did not ask her people to do anything she would not do herself, and she never abandoned anyone who needed protection. "All hands," Vance announced through the ship-wide communication system, her voice reaching every corner of the massive warship. "This is the Commander. We have civilians in distress and a hostile force preventing the rescue." She paused and let her crew absorb the situation. "The Galactic Council has decided that those civilians are not worth the trouble of saving." "I disagree." Another pause. "Longer this time. Battle stations, we are going in. Throughout the Resolve and the 10 other ships of the 9th Fleet. Thousands of human beings moved with purpose and determination. Engineers checked power systems and weapons arrays, while pilots scrambled to their fighters and Marines checked their weapons in case boarding operations became necessary. Medical teams prepared their facilities for Casualties that everyone hoped would not come, but everyone knew to expect the human ships were not. Elegant by galactic standards. Not graceful curves and flowing lines like the vessels that Council species preferred. They were brutal and angular and covered in armor plating. That added mass and reduced speed, but kept their crews alive when enemies tried to kill them. They were warships designed by a species that understood violence in ways that gentler civilizations could not. Imagine Fleet Formation Alpha 7. Vance ordered, "The resolve will take point all ships' weapons hot, but do not fire unless fired upon, or unless I give the order." The fleet moved as one. 11 vessels of various sizes converging on the position, where the gentle current drifted helplessly, and the Obedience waited with weapons armed on the tactical display. Vance could see the Corvette cruiser adjusting its position as the human ships approached. The enemy commander was probably trying to decide whether these newcomers were a threat or merely curious bystanders who could be frightened away with harsh words. He would learn the truth soon. "Enough communications," Vance said. "Open a channel to the civilian vessel. Let them know that help has arrived." The signal went out across the void, carrying the voice of humanity to beings who had almost given up hope. "Attention, medical frigate Gentle Current. This is Commander Elise Vance of the Terran Warship. Resolve, we have received your distress signal, and we are here to render assistance." Pause filled with static and interference from the Corvette jamming systems. "Please stand by. The situation is about to change on the damaged bridge of the Gentle Current." Captain Saurus heard those words and felt tears streaming down her face. She did not know who these humans were, or why they had come when nobody else would, but in that moment, she loved them with a gratitude that she would carry for the rest of her life. "Commander Vance," she transmitted back with a voice that trembled with emotion. "We have wounded aboard, and our life support is failing. Please hurry." "Understood, Captain," Vance replied, and her voice carried a certainty that allowed no doubt. "Nobody else is going to die today. You have my word." The human fleet continued its approach, and the darkness of space suddenly seemed a little less cold across the bridge of the Obedience. Overseer Kreth watched the approaching vessels with growing unease. Had expected the humans to turn away after seeing his warship. Expected them to perform the same calculations that every other species had performed, and reach the same conclusion, but the Deathworlders kept coming. And for the first time in his career, Kreth wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Overseer Kreth had commanded warships for 30 cycles and had never known defeat in battle or negotiation. He was Corvette, a member of a species that had built an empire through military strength and the willingness to use it without hesitation. Hegemony respected power and despised weakness, and Kreth had risen to his position by demonstrating both the ability and the willingness to destroy anyone who opposed the will of his masters. Now he stood on the bridge of the Obedience and watched 11 alien warships position themselves between his cruiser and his prey. The tactical officer provided continuous updates in a voice that grew more uncertain with each passing moment. "The human vessels have formed a defensive perimeter around the refugee ship," he reported. "Their weapon systems are active, and their shields are at full power. They are not attempting to communicate with Council authorities." Kreth studied the tactical display with the careful attention that had kept him alive through dozens of battles. Human ships were smaller than his cruiser on average. Though their flagship appeared roughly equivalent in mass, their technology was unfamiliar, their tactics unknown, their intentions unclear. But one thing was obvious even to a casual observer: these beings were not afraid. The intelligence briefings that Kreth had studied described humans as a primitive species that had only recently achieved faster than light travel. They came from a planet in a remote region of the galaxy. A world that the briefings described as unusually hostile by civilized standards. High gravity, extreme temperature variations, an atmosphere thick with oxygen that made fires burn with terrifying intensity, and a biosphere filled with predators and parasites and diseases. Briefings concluded that humans were emotional and irrational. Prone to making decisions based on feelings rather than logic, they were not to be feared. Merely managed with appropriate firmness looking at the fleet that now blocked his path. Kreth wondered if the intelligence analysts had made a serious error in their assessments. Open a communication channel, he ordered. Deciding that negotiation was the appropriate first response, perhaps these humans could be convinced to withdraw without bloodshed, to perform the same calculations that every other species had performed. Channel open, Overseer. The communications officer confirming Kreth straightened his posture and arranged his features into an expression of confident authority. Terran vessel, he transmitted. You are interfering in hegemony. Enforcement operations. The ship you are protecting contains stolen hegemony assets and is subject to lawful recovery under galactic treaty provisions. He paused to let his words sink in. Withdraw immediately or be designated hostile. This is your only warning. The response came almost immediately, and the voice that carried it was unlike anything Kreth had expected. Commander Vance spoke with a calm that contained no fear and no uncertainty, only a cold determination that made Kreth's subordinates shift uncomfortably at their stations. Hegemony vessel, she said. The ship behind me is a medical frigate carrying 2,000 civilian refugees, including 400 children. They have committed no crime and pose no threat to anyone. Her tone hardened. You will power down your weapons and withdraw to a distance of 500 kilometers. You will permit emergency rescue operations to proceed without interference. This is not a negotiation. Kreth felt anger rising in his chest at the human's presumption. No species spoke to the hegemony this way. Not without consequences. Commander Vance, he replied with deliberate condescension. You clearly do not understand your situation. My vessel is superior to your entire fleet in both firepower and technology. The Galactic Council has not authorized your intervention, and no treaty protects your actions. He leaned forward in his command chair. You speak for no recognized authority. You have no legal standing here. You are visitors in civilized space, and you would do well to remember that. There was a pause that stretched for several heartbeats when Vance spoke again. Her voice had not changed at all, and somehow that consistency was more unsettling than any threat could have been. Overseer Kreth, she said, let me explain something that your intelligence briefings apparently failed to mention about my species. Another pause. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day. We survived ice ages that froze continents and plagues that killed millions and predators that hunted us in the darkness. Her voice remained perfectly level. We learned to fight before we learned to speak. We built civilizations out of blood and sacrifice, and the absolute refusal to give up when sensible beings would have accepted defeat. Kreth listened with growing unease as the human continued. When we look at a situation like this, we do not calculate the political cost of intervention. We do not weigh the value of innocent lives against diplomatic convenience. Vance's voice finally showed emotion, a cold and terrible anger that made even Kreth want to look away. We see people in danger, and we help them. That is who we are. That is what we do, and no treaty or threat or calculation will change that. She paused one final time. You have threatened civilians under my protection. You have 60 seconds to begin your withdrawal before I consider our conversation finished. The bridge of the obedience fell silent As every officer absorbed what they had, just Hardcreth's tactical officer spoke quietly, his voice carrying a note of genuine fear. Overseer, the human vessels are adjusting their formation, their weapons. Systems are tracking our ship. They are not bluffing. Creth knew that he should withdraw, knew that the smart decision was to fall back and report this. In counter to his superiors, the refugees were not worth a battle with an unknown enemy whose capabilities he could not accurately assess, but the hegemony did not retreat, and Overseer Creth had not built his reputation by backing down from challenges. They are bluffing, he declared with more confidence than he felt. No species is foolish enough to start a war over 2,000 worthless refugees. They will back down when they see that we are serious. He turned to his weapons officer. Target the human flagship. Prepare to fire on my command. The tactical display showed the human ships holding their positions. Not advancing, but not retreating either. They simply waited, their weapons hot and their shields strong, and their crews ready for whatever came next. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Creth remembered an old saying that his training instructor had shared with new officers many cycles ago. Be careful when you threaten someone who has nothing to lose. The instructor had warned. They may call your bluff, but these humans had everything to lose. Their ships and their crews and their lives. Why were they not afraid? Why did they not perform the calculations and reach the sensible conclusion? The answer came to Creth in a flash of understanding that arrived too late to change anything they were. Deathworlders she had evolved in conditions that would have driven any sensible species to extinction. They had survived by being stubborn and irrational and absolutely unwilling to surrender, even when surrender was the logical choice. And now they stood between him and his prey, and they were not going to move. The 60 seconds passed. Time is up, Overseer, Commander Vance transmitted. Your weapons are still tracking my ship. I will give you 10 more seconds to correct that error. Creth hesitated, caught between his pride and his growing fear. 5 seconds, Vance counted. Overseer, the tactical officer urged. Perhaps we should fire, Creth ordered, making his choice. The Obedience's plasma lances erupted with deadly light, reaching across the void toward the human flagship, and in that moment, everything changed. The plasma lances of the Obedience struck the forward shields of the TSS Resolve with enough force to melt through station armor and crack the hulls of lesser warships. The bridge shuddered violently, and warning alarms screamed from every console as the shield generators struggled to absorb the incredible energy of the Corvith Weapons Commander. Vance grabbed at the railing in front of her command chair and held on as the deck tilted beneath her feet. Damage report. She shouted over the noise. Forward shields down to 60%. Lieutenant Commander Chon replied, his voice strained but steady. Hull integrity, holding no breaches. They hit us hard, Commander. Vance smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. They hit us with their best shot, and we are still here, she said. Now show them what humans do when someone tries to kill us. She turned to her communications. Officer, all ships' weapons free. Cripple them, but do not destroy them. I want that crew alive to answer for what they have done. The 9th Expeditionary Fleet responded with the coordinated fury of predators who had finally been given permission to hunt human warships. Were not elegant, but they were effective in ways that other species had never needed to develop their weapons. Were designed by beings who understood violence as a fundamental part of existence, who had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting to survive kinetic accelerators, hurled tungsten projectiles at velocities that turned simple metal into devastation. The first salvo struck the Obedience's shields and kept striking, each impact transferring momentum that pushed the massive cruiser off its position. Nuclear-tipped torpedoes followed the kinetic barrage. Their warheads designed to detonate in precise patterns that maximized damage to enemy systems. The Obedience's shields flickered and flared as they absorbed punishment that would have overwhelmed most vessels in seconds. On the bridge of the Corvith cruiser, Overseer Kreth watched in horror as his tactical display filled with warnings and damage reports. "Return fire," he screamed. "Target their engines, target their weapons, destroy them." The Obedience was a powerful vessel. One of the finest warships that the hegemony had ever produced. Its weapons reached out with deadly precision and found human ships that could not evade quickly enough. The destroyer TSS Vigilant took a direct hit to her engineering section and broke apart in a bloom of fire and debris. Her crew of 340 lost in seconds. 2 other human ships suffered damage that forced them to fall back from the engagement, but the remaining 8 vessels did not retreat. They did not even slow down. Commander Vance watched the Vigilant die and end, felt the cold weight of grief settle in her chest. Those had been her people, her responsibility, and she would carry their memory for the rest of her life. But there was no time for mourning now. "Helm," she ordered, her voice hard as steel. "Bring us to close range. I want to look that Corvith in the eye when we tear his ship apart." The helmsman did not hesitate. "Aye, Commander." Closing to point-blank range, the Resolve surged forward with acceleration that would have killed any crew not born on a high-gravity world. Human bodies were dense and strong, evolved to function under conditions that would crush the fragile forms of most galactic species. Their ships were designed to match, capable of maneuvers that enemy tactical computers could not predict, because no sensible species would attempt them. The other human vessels followed their flagship, closing the distance to the Obedience with aggressive precision. Corvette weapons continued to fire, scoring hits that damaged armor and killed crew members who would never see their homes again. But the humans kept coming. They absorbed the punishment and returned it threefold, their weapons hammering the enemy's shields with relentless determination. On the bridge of the Obedience, the tactical officer reported each new disaster with a voice that grew more desperate by the minute. Shields failing in Sections 7 through 12 weapons. Array 3 is offline. We have hull breaches on decks 4, 5, and 6. Kreth stared at the display in disbelief as his mighty warship was systematically torn apart by vessels that his briefings had dismissed as primitive. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "Our technology is superior. Our weapons are more powerful. How are they winning?" His second officer answered with a voice that trembled with fear. "They are not trying to win, Overseer. They are trying to hurt us. They do not care what it costs them." The truth of those words struck Kreth like a physical blow. Every species he had ever fought had approached battle as a calculation, weighing losses against gains and withdrawing when the cost grew too high. But these humans fought as if victory was inevitable, as if the concept of defeat simply did not exist in their minds. They had lost a ship and hundreds of crew members, and they had not even paused to consider retreat. The Resolve closed to point-blank range, so close that Kreth could see the damage on her hull through his view screen. Commander Vance had positioned her flagship directly in front of the Obedience's main weapons batteries, daring the enemy to fire at such close range that both ships would be destroyed. "Your shields are failing," Vance transmitted, her voice calm despite the chaos of battle. "Your weapons are damaged and your engines are losing power. You have one chance to surrender before I finish this." Kreth looked at his tactical display and saw the truth of her words. His ship was dying, torn apart by weapons that his briefings had claimed were inferior to hegemony technology. His crew was dying, killed by beings that his training had taught him to dismiss as primitive and emotional. And the human commander was offering him a choice that no hegemony officer had ever faced before: surrender or Die, Overseer, his second officer whispered. We cannot win this fight. If we continue, we will all die. Kreth's pride screamed at him to keep fighting. To die with honor, rather than accept the humiliation of defeat. But as he looked at the faces of his crew, he saw something that he had never seen before in Corvith's eyes. He saw people who wanted to live. All weapons stand down, he ordered. The words tasting like ash in his mouth. Cut engines and lower shields, signal the humans that we surrender. The bridge fell silent as the order was carried out. The guns of the Obedience fell quiet, and her shields dropped and her engines went cold on the tactical display. The human vessels ceased fire and moved into positions that ensured. The Corvith cruiser could not escape or renew. The battle commander Vance studied the surrendered enemy ship for a long moment before speaking. Secure that vessel, she ordered. Put Marines aboard and take their crew into custody. Want them treated fairly but watched carefully. She turned to face her bridge crew. These men and women who had followed her into battle and paid the price in blood. The Vigilant is gone, she said quietly. 340 of our brothers and sisters are dead. We will mourn them properly when this is over. Her voice hardened, but right now there are 2,000 people on that refugee ship who need our help. Damage control teams to stations. Medical personnel, prepare to receive casualties. We are not finished yet. The crew of the Resolve responded with the determination that had carried humanity through countless trials across their long and violent history. They had won the battle. But the mission was not complete. There were still lives to save. Still innocent people waiting in the darkness for someone to bring them home, and Commander Elise Vance would not rest until every single one of them was safe. The rescue operation took 6 hours. 6 hours of desperate work as human medical teams fought to save lives that were slipping away with each passing minute. Commander Vance supervised the operation from the bridge of the Resolve, coordinating the efforts of her remaining ships, while damage control teams worked to repair the wounds that the Corvith weapons had inflicted on her fleet. The medical frigate Gentle Current was in worse condition than the initial scans had suggested, her life support systems failing, and her hull integrity compromised in ways that made boarding operations dangerous. But the humans did not let danger stop them. They never had medical teams in environmental suits crossed to the damaged vessel through temporary airlocks that engineering crews assembled in record time. The atmosphere inside the Gentle Current was toxic to human lungs, a mixture of gases that the Volanthi found comfortable, but that would have killed any unprotected Terran within minutes. So the humans wore their suits and carried their equipment and did their jobs despite the discomfort and the danger. They found the refugees huddled in cargo bays and corridors, families who had given up hope and could not quite believe that salvation had finally arrived. The children stared at the strange beings in their bulky suits with wide eyes full of wonder. These were creatures from the stories that their parents had told them, Deathworlders from the edge of the galaxy, and they had come to help. Dr. Chun, the chief medical officer of the Resolve, worked alongside the Volanthi medical staff to stabilize the most critical patients. He was a small man with gentle hands and a calm voice that seemed to reassure everyone who heard it, even those who could not understand his words. We have 47 critical cases, he reported to Commander Vance through the communication link. We are moving them to the Resolve's medical bay as quickly as we can. We have already lost 3 patients who are too far gone to save. Vance closed her eyes for a moment and absorbed the weight of those deaths. 3 more lives that the galaxy's silence had claimed. 3 more people who might have survived if anyone had answered the call sooner. Do everything you can, Doctor, she replied. These people have suffered enough. Captain Yellen Saurus was among the last to leave her ship. She had insisted on remaining aboard until every refugee was safely evacuated. moving through the failing corridors of her vessel to offer comfort and assistance wherever she could. When the human Marines finally escorted her across the temporary airlock to the Resolve, she was exhausted and heartbroken, and overwhelmed with emotions that she could barely contain. Commander Vance was waiting for her in the landing bay, standing at attention as the Valanthi captain stepped aboard. "Captain Saurus," Vance said, her voice formal but her eyes warm. "Welcome to the Resolve. I am sorry we could not reach you sooner." Saurus looked at the human woman who had risked everything to save strangers she had never met, and something inside her broke. She began to weep, tears streaming down her translucent face as the terror and despair of the past 2 days finally released their grip on her hearts. "You came," she whispered, her voice broken with gratitude. "Nobody was supposed to come. We called and called, and nobody answered. But you came." Vance stepped forward and placed a hand on the Valanthi captain's shoulder, a gesture that crossed the boundaries of species and culture to offer simple human comfort. "Someone always should," she said quietly, "and when no one else will, we will." Saurus looked into the human's eyes and saw something that she had rarely encountered in her long career among the stars. She saw genuine compassion, a sincere concern for the welfare of others that asked nothing in return. The Galactic Council spoke of such values in their treaties and their speeches, but the humans simply lived them. The Corvith prisoners were transferred to secure holding areas on 3 different ships, their weapons confiscated and their wounds treated by the same medical staff who were saving refugee lives. Overseer Kreth endured the humiliation of captivity in silence, his pride shattered and his understanding of the universe fundamentally changed. He had believed that the hegemony represented the pinnacle of power, that military strength was the only measure that mattered in galactic affairs. But these humans had shown him another kind of strength, a determination born not from conquest, but from conviction. They had fought not to gain territory or resources, but simply because innocent people needed their help. It was a concept so foreign to his training that he could barely comprehend it 2 days after the rescue. The Galactic Council finally broke its silence. A formal message arrived at the Resolve, demanding an explanation for what the Council termed unauthorized Terran military action in neutral space. The message expressed concern about escalating tensions and urged humanity to exercise restraint in future encounters with hegemony forces. It said nothing about the 2,000 refugees whose lives had hung in the balance. It said nothing about the 47 hours of silence that had nearly condemned those people to death. It said nothing about the 340 human crew members who had died to save strangers that the Council had abandoned. Commander Vance read the message and felt the cold fury that had sustained her through the battle flare back to life. "Communications," she ordered. "Open a channel broadcast on all frequencies. I want every station and ship and colony in this sector to hear what I have to say." The channel opened, and Vance spoke with a voice that carried across the stars. "To the Galactic Council," she began. "You heard the call for help, and you did nothing. You let your laws become an excuse for cowardice, and your treaties become justification for abandoning the innocent." She paused to let her words settle over all who listened. "We are humanity. We come from a world that tried to kill us every day of our evolution. We survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly destroyed us, and through all of it, we learned one lesson that your civilized species never had to learn." Her voice hardened. "We learned that survival means nothing if we abandon those who need us. We learned that strength is worthless if it is not used to protect the weak. We learned that the measure of a people is not how they treat their allies, but how they treat strangers in need." Across the galaxy, beings of 100 species listened to the human commander's words. Refugee stations and occupied worlds and the desperate places where the forgotten huddled in darkness. Ears and antennae and sensory organs turned toward the message that echoed through space. Let this stand as notice to the galaxy, Vance declared. Wherever there is a signal in the dark, wherever the helpless call out and the powerful turn away, we will answer. Her voice rose with conviction that could not be denied. We will always answer, and if that makes us your enemy, if standing for the innocent puts us against your treaties and your calculations and your comfortable silence, then so be it. She paused one final time, and when she spoke again, her words carried the weight of a species that had been forged in the fires of a hostile world. We are the Deathworlders. We are humanity, and we will not look away. The transmission ended in the medical bay of the Resolve. Captain Saurus listened to those words while holding the hand of a young refugee child who had lost her parents in the attack on their homeworld. Child did not understand the language that the human commander spoke, but she understood the tones. He understood that somewhere in the darkness, there were people who would come when others called for help, for the first time since her world had burned. The child smiled, and across the galaxy, in the hidden places where hope had nearly died, other beings heard the same message. They heard a species that had emerged from an deadly world and chosen to use its strength not for conquest, but for compassion. They heard an answer to prayers that they had almost stopped speaking. They heard humanity, and for the first time in living memory, the desperate and the abandoned and the forgotten felt something that the Galactic Council had never given them. They felt hope on the bridge of the Resolve. Commander Elise Vance stood at the view screen and looked out at the stars that stretched endlessly in every direction. She thought of the crew members she had lost, the 340 souls who would never go home. She thought of the refugees they had saved, the 2,000 lives that now had a chance at a future. She thought of the message she had broadcast, the promise she had made on behalf of all humanity. It was a heavy burden to carry, a commitment that would demand sacrifices she could not yet imagine, but it was the right burden, the right commitment, the right thing to do. That was enough. That would always be enough.